Hello, happy Monday. Welcome to our May Purple Chair Chat. My name is Evelyn. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm an education and prevention specialist at Jana's Campaign. And this Purple Chair Chat is all about domestic violence and mental health because May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So I just want to welcome everyone who's watching today. We're going to be talking about how domestic violence affects a survivor's mental health, mental illness, and domestic violence perpetrators, as well as what we can do and what resources are available to survivors. Purple Chair Chats are live conversations instilling the knowledge, skills, and values necessary to prevent gender and relationship violence. We use these discussions to raise awareness, engage bystanders, promote healthy and respectful relationships, and encourage the development of new social norms. Before we start today, I want to make a disclaimer. I will be discussing some sensitive topics regarding gender and relationship violence that might be triggering for some, particularly when we're focusing on mental health. So please do whatever you need to take care of yourself. If you are in need of resources or services and do not know who your local advocates are, reach out to us. We'll do our best to put you in contact with those right people. As always, there will be resources below as well, so feel free to check those out. And there are also multiple resources used in today's Purple Chair Chat content. We always cite those. They include womensadvocate.org, National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, Alta Center's National Network to End Domestic Violence, and healthday.org. Let's start talking about mental health effects on domestic violence survivors. So the psychological impacts of domestic violence can cause victims to suffer from serious mental health conditions for years, if not for the rest of their lives. Some of these conditions include depression, generalized anxiety disorder, high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about each of these things, the first one being depression. Survivors of domestic violence are nearly twice as likely to suffer depressive symptoms compared to people who have not experienced domestic abuse. These symptoms include a loss of energy, change in appetite, change in sleeping habits, difficulty concentrating, indecisiveness, restlessness, as well as feelings of guilt, feelings of hopelessness, and also thoughts of self-harm. The effects of depression can be debilitating and significantly impact a survivor's ability to carry out even the simplest of everyday tasks, like going to work or maintaining relationships with family or their friends, the people who really care about them in their life. Survivors often also voice many concerns about prejudice and bias regarding mental health, as their mental health status is sometimes used against them, especially by abusers when they try and seek services. For example, abusers might also attempt to discredit or undermine a survivor who suffers from depression in custody battles or other court-related services and among family and friends. And so survivors are more hesitant to come forward for those particular reasons. And as we talk about mental health effects from domestic violence, I also think it's important for us to talk about a concept that's known as agency, or a loss of agency. So agency is the technical term for the feeling of essentially being in charge of your life, knowing where you stand, knowing that you have a say in what happens to you, knowing you have some ability to shape your own circumstances. For survivors, sometimes they feel like that's gone. And not being able to discern what's going on inside their bodies causes survivors to sometimes be out of touch with their needs, what's going on. They have trouble taking care of themselves, and failure to be in touch with themselves contributes to a well-documented lack of self-protection, as well as high rates of re-victimization. All right, let's talk about PTSD. One of the lesser acknowledged outcomes of domestic violence is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It's a psychiatric disorder in which a person has difficulty recovering after experiencing or witnessing a terrifying event. It can result from any traumatic event, a war, a serious accident, but domestic violence is often an under-recognized cause. So symptoms of PTSD are sometimes difficult to establish. There are considerable overlap between PTSD and other mental health conditions, which is why it's sometimes hard to distinguish. However, symptoms are normally defined by three overarching categories. The first of these categories is avoidance. So what this means is avoiding reminders or triggers of the traumatic event, such as people, places, thoughts, events, all of those types of things. The second category is reactivity. Sudden, inexplicable anger, outbursts, difficulty being reached emotionally, feeling numb, trouble sleeping, and startling easily as well. And then the third of these categories is reliving the event, being confronted by the emotional trauma of the event suddenly without obvious reason, resulting in an emotional outburst or chills, heart palpitations, extreme anxiety, those kinds of similar symptoms. Left untreated, PTSD can cause long-term mental health effects, including anger management issues, intense loneliness, but we also know that if left untreated, PTSD can increase the likelihood of several life-threatening health conditions, things like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, substance abuse disorders. So let's talk about what PTSD from domestic violence looks like. Like I mentioned earlier, PTSD can develop in anyone experiencing a major life-threatening event, and this includes domestic violence, which exposes the victim to varying degrees of fear, vulnerability, and helplessness. The fear experienced from a traumatic event can become overwhelming, but it's often not dealt with immediately due to the abuser still living in close quarters or being in the victim's life regularly. The likelihood of PTSD increases after a domestic abuse event, though its effects can be mitigated through seeking emotional support. However, this isn't always possible, as it requires trusted family, trusted friends, people who are willing to listen and who are willing to potentially intervene as well. It's essential to have those things. Other risk factors that increase the likelihood of a domestic violence victim developing PTSD include sustaining a physical injury, feeling helpless, lack of supportive community, having to deal with additional stressors before and after the event, as well as already having a history of mental illness or addiction. Let's move on to discussing mental illness and domestic violence perpetration. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, a common assumption is that domestic abuse is caused by a partner's mental health condition. Some of the terms thrown around are bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, PTSD, narcissistic personality, that's a big one that's talked about, borderline personality, antisocial personality. No doubt, these are serious mental health conditions, right? But they are not the cause for domestic abuse. I want to be perfectly clear, nothing in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders states that a mental illness solely causes a partner to be abusive. But there are a distinct number of diagnoses that can increase the risk of abusive patterns to show up in a relationship, that show up in other parts of an individual's life. There are cases of individuals who have mental illness and who are also abusive to their partners. But there are also lots of individuals who have a mental illness and are healthy and are supportive partners. If a partner does have a mental illness and they're abusive, it's important to keep in mind that the mental illness and the abusive behaviors need to be addressed separately, as separate issues by the abusive partner. It is the abusive partner's responsibility to seek out support, to create their own plan for managing their mental illness, their stress, be accountable for their abusive behavior. If a partner is not owning up to their actions, right, they're not admitting how much they're hurting the victim, they're not seeking out professional help, it's a sign that the partner is not willing to change. And if that's the case, then the abuse a lot of times in the relationship tends to continue and actually escalate over time. The main thing I'm trying to say is even if a partner does have mental illness, there is no excuse. There's never an excuse for abuse. Abuse is a choice that someone makes in order to maintain power and control over a partner. If a partner is abusive, regardless of whether they have a mental illness or not, they have no right to treat their partner in that manner. People always deserve to have a healthy, loving, supportive, trusting, and safe relationship 100% of the time. Let's talk about domestic violence and mental health of children. A case study involving over 17,700 adults took part in a survey on mental health. Now, What I'm about to discuss is a specific case study, but there's lots of research out there on what's known as the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which essentially looks at adults who have experienced trauma in their childhoods and the way it affects them in their adult lives, mentally, emotionally, physically, all of those things. So if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to dive into those ACE studies, but for this particular one we're talking about, 326 of these adults said they witnessed parental domestic violence more than 10 times before the age of 16. So 10 times before the age of 16 is classified as chronic. Among those who experienced chronic parental domestic violence during childhood, 22.5% of them had major depression at some point in their life, 15% of them had an anxiety disorder, and nearly 27% of them had a substance abuse disorder. In comparison, the rates among people with no history of violence between their parents were 9% for depression, 7% for anxiety, and 19% for substance abuse. So you can really see the statistical difference between those numbers, and it's pretty significant. Many children who are exposed to their parents' domestic violence remain constantly vigilant, perpetually anxious. They're fearful that any conflict might escalate into an assault. Therefore, it's not surprising that even decades later, when they're adults, those with a history of parental domestic violence, they have this elevated prevalence of anxiety disorders, right? But there are always things that we can do. There are always things we can do to help, to support people. So I want to talk with you all about some ways to promote mental health and mental wellness for survivors and just kind of be there. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health related to domestic violence. The first is to create an emotional safety plan, kind of work with them for that, develop a self-care plan, explore the survivor's strengths to kind of help build them up that way. Learn more about setting personal boundaries and some tips or some keys that you can discuss with them on setting personal boundaries. Try out various simple mindfulness exercises or guided meditation practices, and absolutely seek professional mental health support. A lot of domestic violence agencies offer confidential counseling, which is an amazing resource as well. So I want to thank you for joining us in this month's Mental Health Purple Chair Chat. We love being able to have live conversations, instilling the knowledge, skills, and values necessary to prevent gender and relationship violence. We hope you were able to learn something today maybe you didn't already know before, especially about domestic violence mental health. As always, if you're in need of resources or services and don't know who your local advocates are, reach out to us. We will put you in contact with those right people. And I just want to say thank you again, everyone, for watching these and all of the support, and we will see you again next month.